Hey, welcome back. This is part 13 of the Space Between YouTube series, in which we are exploring the space between the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, except for the past couple of weeks, we're no longer in the space between. We are now firmly in the land of the New Testament, though we're talking about things that happen behind the scenes and not necessarily in the narrative of the Gospels and Acts. So last week we talked a bit about Herod and his successors, his somewhat incompetent sons who caused a whole lot of problems. But this week I want to take a step back. And we're going to kind of be in the same general time frame, but instead of talking about the lives of the rich and powerful, I want to take a step back and look at what we can say about the common people, about what life was like in Galilee for Jesus as a child and as a young adult. Because we're talking a lot these days about Mary and Joseph because we're in Advent. And so I think it's probably worthwhile to think about what life was like in Galilee. Now, you may remember a couple of weeks ago at the beginning of the Hasmonean dynasty. Remember, this is when Judas Maccabee and his brothers had kicked out the Seleucids, and they were an independent nation for the first time in a very long time. And one of the things that they did was they paid Judeans to go up to Galilee and to settle up there and to create small Jewish towns. And so essentially, because of centuries of war, there was not a whole lot of people up in Galilee. And so these people could go up there and they could just claim plots of land without having to, displace people. And they could create family farms and they could live off of the land because as Judea tends to be more mountainous and arid and rocky, Galilee is very open. It's good farmland and there's some large bodies of water for fishing. So it's a fairly nice place to just live a slow, rural lifestyle. So for like 150 years after that, these family farms dotted the landscapes. And there were these small towns like Nazareth where Jesus was raised that may have had maybe 400 people on a good day. But all of this started to change when the Romans took over and put Herod in charge. Because when Herod took over, Herod, as king, owned all of the land in Judea and Galilee, and so was as free as anyone to just give land away as he saw fit. And so he did, as most rulers would do, as payment for favors, or as gifts for friends and allies. You might say, well, to thank you for your service, we're giving you these acres in Galilee. And so those space between the family farms started to fill up with larger farms that were owned by rich people who didn't have to pay quite as much taxes because they knew Herod. And pretty soon it got harder for the small families to expand, for the children to have their farm next to their parents' farm and to farm that land that they'd been on for 6 generations. And the farms next to you that the rich people owned were probably farmed by slaves, and they outperformed your crops. And, then maybe one year there was a drought, and so the harvest was pretty slim, and you were having a really hard time both feeding your family and affording Herod's taxes, because Herod was building these massive cities and fortresses all over the place, and so he needed to raise taxes on the whole population in order to pay for his big buildings. And so you were having a hard time paying taxes that year. But no worries, your rich neighbor comes along and says, hey, I will give you a loan so that you can pay your taxes this year, and you can put up next year's harvest as collateral. But then next year rolls around, and Herod has increased taxes because he has to have yet another mountaintop fortress for some strange reason. And the harvest is not quite what you would imagine, and the interest is coming due from your neighbor's loan. And so your neighbor brings you an offer you just can't refuse. The offer is to buy out your family farm, to annex it to their mega farm. But don't worry, your neighbors are going to let you live there and let you still work the land that your family has worked for 6 or 7 generations. You just won't have to worry about taxes. And it seems like a pretty sweet gig, for maybe a year or two before you realize that your family is barely surviving. They're starving while they're working day and night for someone else's benefit, for a neighbor that doesn't actually care about you and doesn't actually live in Galilee anymore, has moved into one of Herod's big cities. And so within a generation or two, there really weren't any more family farms in Galilee. And all of the land was owned by a handful of wealthy landowners who then rented out all of the farms to sharecroppers who were living at or just above the poverty rate. One estimate that I read said that all of the land, all of the farms were owned by maybe 1% of the population. The richest 1% owned all of the land, and somewhere close to 90% of the people of Galilee were either living in poverty or just above the poverty level, where one bad harvest might mean not eating and people dying of starvation. Life under Roman occupation was oppressive, to say the least, for the vast majority of people. And so in places like Galilee, young men without a future, without a family farm to look after and with mouths to feed, and young families would venture off into the cities to look for work. They would look for work as a day laborer, picking olives, or as a builder or a contractor or whatnot. And as they're roaming the streets looking for work, they might come into contact with organized crime or pirates or anti-Roman or anti-wealthy revolutionaries. And you see this today in Syria or in Afghanistan and all of these places where there's just no work in the fields anymore, and so people are moving into the cities. Actually, you see this in the United States as well. This is kind of a trend that happens when rural people are disaffected and don't have the resources to survive anymore. You start to see groups of young and angry people in the cities wondering why the world has been taken away from their families and they don't have the life that their parents had. And so when Herod died, Judas the Galilean, somebody whose name you're going to want to remember, he organized an armed revolt and he took the city of Sepphoris, which was the biggest city in Galilee. And he took all the weapons, he took all the supplies, he took all the gold from the wealthy elite that lived in the city that owned all of the lands that, his family used to own. And they attempted to take back Galilee for the people, which, of course, they were quickly squashed by the Romans, who didn't take too kindly to uprisings. And so Judas and his men went underground, and Robin Hood style, and were just a thorn in the side of the rich and the powerful and the Romans and the connected in Galilee for the next couple of decades. And when Rome took over Judea and they issued a census for the taxes, remember we talked about this last week, he and his people went around and they told people that if you do this, if you pay taxes to Rome, if you give in, this is no better than slavery, and you are being unfaithful to God. You're saying that I don't have faith that God can deliver me by giving in to Rome. And so if you go ahead and do this, we're going to burn down your house and steal your cattle. And so they did. They had this reign of terror across the land that anyone who took the census, anyone who was in league with Rome or paid their taxes could find themselves losing what little they had. And they urged everyone to rise up in arms against the 1% and their Roman allies. And people did. There was a lot of uprisings. And thus began the fourth philosophy, as Josephus calls it, the Zealots. Josephus says that they were theologically most similar to the Pharisees, except they held that there was no king but God, and compliance with Rome was akin to slavery. And they believed that God would rescue them as a people, but only if they took matters into their own hands, because that was a show of faith. that they believed that God would guide their hands. And so they believed that if they took the first step in fighting back against Rome, that God would give them the miraculous strength that he gave to the judges and to the kings and the generals and the prophets in the Old Testament. And so they encouraged people to reject Rome, to reject Herod, and the entire notion of a king of Israel. And they were much less organized than the other philosophies, the Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes, much less organized, and they didn't really have any kind of central leadership. We have a hard time tracking them as a people, but the philosophy and the spirit behind them pervaded like every aspect of society. And so even if you couldn't say who was in charge of the zealots or where was the monthly zealot meeting, like everyone knew what the zealots believed and this kind of undercurrent that was going through all of the land. And Jesus was about 10 years old, living in Galilee, when Judas of Galilee staged his revolt and the zealots were born. And this would have absolutely resonated with Jesus and with his family, because life in Galilee was getting harder for people like Jesus and Mary and Joseph. See, when Herod Antipas was made the governor of Galilee, he set about modernizing the rural area by doing what his dad did and making these big building projects and creating these modern cities in Sephora and in Tiberias. And one of the things that meant was that he had to increase taxes on people and he had to find new ways of making money. And so he also took over the fishing industry on the Sea of Galilee. He bought all of the fishing boats and he rented them out to local fishermen and made them buy fishing licenses and pay taxes out of their what they pulled in, just the way that he had done to farmers. So he now owned a monopoly on farming and fishing, and anyone who wanted to eat had to go through Herod. And so you have these many landless men who no longer have their family farms or their family fishing business, and they're out in the cities searching for work in anything that they can find as day laborers or construction workers, since that's where Herod was pouring all the money. And since Nazareth, where Jesus was grown up, was only 3 miles from Sephora, the capital, it's likely that Joseph made his living as a construction worker for Herod in this new city that he was building. And now we've generally understood that Jesus and Joseph were carpenters, as in the modern sense of woodworkers. But the word here for carpenter, tekton, generally just means builder, or contractor, or construction worker. In fact, there are not a whole lot of trees in Galilee. It's mostly farmlands. There's a quarry not too far from Nazareth. All of the houses in Sephora and in Nazareth were made out of stone, not out of wood. So it's more likely that Jesus and Joseph were stone workers, were masons, were maybe general fix-it men or construction workers, you might think of them. Which brings new meaning to the New Testament calling Jesus the stone the builders rejected, right? If Jesus was a stone mason. Also, I don't know, kind of makes me feel some kind of way thinking about Jesus, earning barely a living wage doing construction work for Herod Antipas and growing up seeing this man's opulence and giving up his body and his hands to just barely scrape by so that he could create this dream palace for this man. It's no wonder that he later called him a fox and he said that he has no real power. So over the lifetime of Jesus, there are at least a dozen stories of messianic figures who gathered a following of the poor and the disaffected people, generally from Galilee, and promised that God was going to deliver them through supernatural means. And they were, to the one, squashed by the Romans violently. The Romans didn't really play around. And so in this way, the Jesus movement was not particularly noteworthy. I mean, he was just another poor Galilean man traveling from town to town, telling the rich to stop exploiting the poor and finding ways to feed the hungry and the poor. I mean, it's no wonder that Jesus was so free to travel and his people with him, because they didn't have a family farm to look after. It had been taken by the rich, by the government, by the Herods, by the Romans. And Jesus taught allegiance to God, not to Caesar. He was pretty clear about that. And he continually refused to grovel before Herod. Actually, at his trial, when he was brought before Herod, the Herod that he probably was a contract worker for in his youth, and Herod questioned him, he refused to answer him. He just stared him down in defiance. Yeah. And so Jesus was not particularly noteworthy to the people to his contemporaries. And then when he went into the temple and he destroyed the marketplace, he became a threat to the 1% in Judea, and they had him executed. And this would have barely registered on the radar of most people in Israel at that time, honestly. It's like, well, Rome killed another Messiah, so it goes. Guess we'll have to wait another 4 days until the next one shows up, right? But something about Jesus' ministry was different, since we're still talking about it today. So what was different about Jesus? What was it? Something he said, something he did, something he was? Why was he not just another zealot revolutionary? Another Robin Hood type figure of wealth redistribution? Why did his movement continue after his death when all the rest of them were lost to history? Well, to answer that question, we're going to have to follow the Zealots into their final battle with Rome, into an impossible, all-out war with a global superpower. A final battle at the end of the world, the last stand of God's beleaguered chosen people. A war that will literally shape the course of human history more than any other war in history. And I don't think I'm overstating that. A war that will in many ways create Christianity and modern Judaism as we know them today. A war which we will discuss next week in our dramatic conclusion to the Space Between series. I'll see you then.